Territories, local government and major projects.
Well, thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to rise and to participate in this debate and join with my fellow parliamentarians from all sides of the chamber to express my horror, my revulsion and the most fundamental moral contempt for the attackers in Paris and what they have done, and in doing so to speak on behalf of my constituents in Bradfield and of course to express sentiments which I'm confident are shared by every Australian. In recent weeks, Mr Deputy Speaker, the world has seen numerous terrible atrocities carried out by extremist terrorist organisations. The attacks in Paris, in which some 130 people were killed and very large numbers were injured, was sadly just one of an extremely troubling series of events. In October, 103 people were killed in Ankara after two suicide bombers detonated their bombs in a crowd of peace activists. On the day before the attacks in Paris, suicide bombers killed 43 people in Beirut. And in Mali last week, 21 people were killed after extremist militants took over 100 people hostage at a hotel in that nation's capital, and of course the Russian jetliner that was downed by what is now believed to be a terrorist bomb is yet another example of the disturbing and troubling series of atrocities which we have seen around the world. Mr Deputy Speaker, the sheer numbers are shocking in their magnitude, but what they remind us of is the fact that we are engaged in a battle of fundamental values. On the one hand, we have a murderous group bent on forcing people to live in a repressive theocratic state through the use of force. On the other hand, we have the values represented by liberal democratic nations like France. All that we hear about the violent repression imposed on those who live in the parts of Iraq and Syria controlled by the terrorist group ISIL or Daesh is extremely troubling. While information about daily life is limited, what we do know is that fear and brutality are used daily as weapons against the people living under the control of this evil group. Extreme restrictions have been imposed on a bewildering array of aspects of day-to-day life, and any violation of those restrictions can result in imprisonment, torture or execution. Mr Deputy Speaker, it was, I think, no accident that Daesh decided to mount this attack in Paris, a city which is significant for so many reasons, but a city which was at the very centre of the Enlightenment, an era of human progress in which medieval superstition yielded to rational, fact-based inquiry, and of course a period of history in which the recognition of and the emphasis on the rights and possibilities of the individual, regardless of class or background, began to emerge. The philosophical advances made during the Enlightenment underpin much of what forms the basis of our democracy here in Australia and similar democracies all around the world. Ideas of individual liberties such as freedom of religion and freedom of expression, and the idea of a social contract between citizens and the state. The work of key figures of this period, such as Voltaire and Rousseau, contributed very substantially to the formation of the very concept and in turn the reality of the modern democratic state. And as a city which was at the very epicentre of this philosophical activity, Paris has long embodied and stood for these ideas. It was also, Mr Deputy Speaker, I suggest, no accident that these terrorists chose to attack people who are out enjoying themselves, enjoying some of the simple pleasures of life, having dinner or a drink in a restaurant or bar, watching a football game, attending a concert. Because the notion of people being free to choose how they spend their time, the notion of people being free to spend some of their time simply enjoying themselves, is anathema to totalitarian regimes and even more so theocratic regimes. ISIL's hatred of such freedoms is evident in the oppressive and violent way in which they control areas like Raqqa in Syria, a place where people live in a constant state of terror and where the ability to enjoy life's simple pleasures is virtually non-existent. We can often frame the rights and freedoms that we enjoy in a country like Australia in high-minded terms. But it is these simple pleasures, Mr Deputy Speaker, which bring so much meaning to life. The opportunity to spend time with friends and family, the opportunity to enjoy yourself, to engage in recreation, and to do that at a time of your choice, making your own judgment. And attacks of the kind that took place in Paris are designed out of a completely different and utterly hostile impulse. They are designed out of an impulse and a desire to prevent us from living our lives freely and without fear. One of the themes of the classic novel of life under a repressive totalitarian regime, 1984, was this notion that the ordinary and simple pleasures of life were not to be permitted to people in that regime. And indeed the loyal party servant Winston, the hero of that novel, who briefly enjoyed some of those pleasures, was quickly caught and punished for doing that. And Orwell's novel reminds us that totalitarian regimes take a very dim view of people enjoying the simple and routine and ordinary pleasures of life. And sadly, the hostility to people enjoying those simple pleasures is at the very core of the approach of this violent and oppressive movement and the theocracy which it has established and which it purports to speak for. Mr Deputy Speaker, tragedies of this kind, of the kinds that we have seen in recent weeks, do prompt us to reflect on the values and freedoms that define us as a nation, particularly in light of the obvious fact that these attacks are very much framed with a view to damaging and destroying the values and the lifestyles based on those values which we enjoy in a country like Australia. Of course, in referring to ISIL's objectives in seeking to establish a theocratic state, I very much join with the observations which have been made by so many that ISIL should certainly not be taken as representative of Islam, and that, in fact, in many ways, its behaviours are entirely at odds with religious practice and philosophies of all the world's great faiths. Mr Deputy Speaker, it is very important in a liberal democratic nation like Australia that as we take the necessary and appropriate steps to the maximum extent possible to guard and protect against the threat which is presented by a global terrorist movement like ISIL or Daesh, it is very important that we do not inadvertently surrender the basic freedoms which are central to our way of life and which go to the core of that clash of values between what underpins a Western liberal democracy like Australia or like France and the perverted ideology which is motivating this group of evil terrorists. Of course, there are difficult choices which must be made, and we do need to take appropriate steps, as the Turnbull government is doing, with the support of the opposition, which we welcome, to protect as best we can the Australian people against the threat to our collective physical safety. But it is very important that our fundamental values as a nation, freedom of thought, freedom of worship, freedom of association, continue to be championed, continue to be observed. And ultimately, what is extraordinarily important is that the great diversity of our nation, our ethnic diversity, the fact that Australians come from every corner of the world, the fact that Australia has amongst the highest percentages of adult population born overseas of any OECD nation, the fact that many faiths are practiced in Australia and people are free to choose to practice any faith or no faith as they judge appropriate. All of these values, all of these practices are enormously important. They contribute enormously to the strength of our democracy and to the quality of our collective lives, and it is extraordinarily important that we hold true to the values which define us as a nation. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I conclude my remarks by expressing, on behalf of the people of Bradfield, my deep sympathy and condolences to the family and friends of all those who have been lost in this series of terrorist attacks, and my very strong support, again on behalf of the people of Bradfield, for the people of Paris and of France, and of course the people of all the nations where these terrible attacks have occurred, and the hope that these nations will properly respond to what has occurred, and that collectively the world can restate the values that we hold, and that the terrorists will not succeed.
Are there any statements?